The word Renaissance was originally applied to the flowering of arts and learning that occurred here in Italy. Underlying the term was the idea that present attainments were a rebirth of a golden age local to Italy, namely ancient Rome. Italy's real monopoly on artistic rebirth began in the 16th century with the first modern historians of art, most of whom, as it happened, were Italian. Filled with local pride, they obscured the nature of the great century of change. For 100 years earlier, in the 15th century, even Italians looked northward to the art of Jan Van Eyck for examples of supreme artistic achievement.
Jan Van Eyck made paintings that for the first time resembled almost perfectly the real world. So much so that he transformed the craft of painting into the supreme art. His work launched an artistic renaissance in Northern Europe that rivals the achievements of his Italian contemporaries and that remains uncannily relevant to us today. I'll be telling the story of this other Renaissance, this northern one. It's an astonishing movement that founded some of our most deeply held beliefs about art and about artists. It begins with a new way of painting, but it soon expands to become a true image revolution.
At around 1500, a young German painter harnessed a new technology that transformed everything. The printing press made images available to a vastly expanded audience, and this painter used it to become the first world-famous artist. Soon the image revolution of the North became a revolt against images. Instead of making images, people passionately broke them, and in the wake of that destruction, modern art was born.
Taken together, these breakthroughs created a northern renaissance that changed art forever.
In the year 1420, Europe was a continent in the shadow of an unprecedented catastrophe. Just 60 years earlier, plague had wiped out more than a third of the entire population. The church stood divided, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon. Meanwhile, the old political powers of the North, England and France, were locked in a conflict that would last 100 years. But one area above all others was flourishing: Flanders, in present-day Belgium and Holland. And from there, a profound artistic revolution spread out across the continent. St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent still holds the painting, a great altarpiece, that started that revolution.
The Ghent altarpiece has overwhelmed viewers since it stood complete in 1432. People of the time pronounced it the most beautiful work in Christendom, and its chief creator, Jan Van Eyck, was deemed the prince of painters. Today it remains arguably the finest single painting in the world, and of all its many wonders, the one most singled out for praise is the figure of Adam.
To early observers, this painted Adam looked like a living being. Paint captures the minute subtleties of flesh, blood, seems to pulse beneath flesh, and the skin of Adam's hands and face is visibly tanned by the sun. One detail intensifies this semblance of animation. Adam raises his big toe so that you can see its underside. The toe seems even to stick out of the stone niche where the figure stands, allowing Adam to appear to step into our world. Remember, this is Adam who sinned, who therefore died, and who, as the ongoing consequence of his sin, made us all mortal. In the painting, Adam lives again. Resurrected, he strides towards the paradise he lost.
For the first time in the history of art, the dead were seen to live again. And with this rebirth, a new historical epoch began. Here in Northern Europe, this period had a different shape and different heroes than the more famous Renaissance in Italy. Yet in a sense, the Northern Renaissance is the more stunning rebirth, and the man who launched it here in Ghent was, according to the people of the time, the greatest painter who ever lived.
And through astonishing paintings like this, Jan Van Eyck reinvented what his craft at its highest level could do. More than any single artist, he made painting into the ultimate art. During the preceding century, all across Europe, the supreme arts, both in price and in status, were luxury objects made of a mixture of expensive materials. Today, these are generally consigned to museums of decorative or applied art. The market for these objects was international, centered on the courts of royalty and nobility. And because these artists themselves circulated through these courts, all works, no matter what their medium or purpose, have the same recognizable look and the same elegant style.
Style advertised a person's belonging to a certain lifestyle. It exhibited the magnificence that distinguished nobles from ordinary people. Things in the courtly style aimed to look expensive. Ideally, they consisted of the most expensive materials worked in the most time-consuming ways. This explains the dominance of tapestries as an art form.
The finest tapestries would be woven of silk thread, individually entwined in silver and gold. They told stories commemorating famous victories or religious scenes. But by the beginning of the 15th century, the hunger for such ostentatiously luxurious objects, such as tapestry, began to be replaced by a taste for something new. And this change took root in the most lavish culture in Europe of the time, the court of the Duke of Burgundy. To recover that now forgotten world, we need to travel south from Flanders. The dynasty of the Dukes of Burgundy had its traditional seat in the wine-growing regions southeast of Paris. But through marriage, diplomacy, and war, their territories eventually stretched all the way back to Flanders. In this culture, magnificence publicized power.
Indeed, the dukes sincerely believed that their own lavish spending trickled down to benefit the entire population of Burgundy. According to economic theorists of the day, courtly expenditure was like the wind that drives the windmills, like the rain that fertilizes the fields.
The works the dukes commissioned included hundreds of huge, precious tapestries, enough to cover their many residences inside and out. Useless but staggeringly costly objects made of gold, gems, pearls, and opaque enamel were displayed briefly, only to be melted down to make new confections. Indeed, like the fabulous foods served at Burgundian court festivities, such works took long to prepare but were swiftly consumed. The first Duke of an expanded Burgundy assembled a dazzling team of artists, including one momentous innovator, the Netherlandish sculptor Claus Sluiter. And it's in his work, in the medium of carved stone, that a new realism first appears. Before Sluiter, in the great cathedrals of Western Europe, monumental sculpture remained subordinate to architecture. Inert figures stood contained by the structures they embellished. Sluiter changed all this.
Imagine you lived in the year 1400 and you were asked to predict which art would reign supreme over the next 600 years. I think if you came to the Well of Moses here in Dijon, you would place your bet on sculpture. The sculptor of this well, Sluiter, has been able to do things with stone which no one previously had been able to do. He is able to give each of these figures of Old Testament prophets a gravity and a presence which makes them look like living beings. It's not simply the way he represents them in the round as figures capable of movement, but it's also the way he individualizes each of the figures. The way the shoes are built, the way the clothing hangs, such that each of the figures seems both alive and completely individualized.
While painting was an important art in this period, it was not yet the art of arts. Indeed, it was often little more than an embellishment to sculpture. Altarpieces of the period show clearly that sculpture was the dominant craft.
Paintings occur in these ensembles on the shutters, on the outer part, the everyday side. They tell stories and prepare the way for the glorious spectacle that will occur when they open up.
And that spectacle, that climax, both ritually as well as aesthetically of the altarpiece, occurs in the medium of sculpture, not painting.
The painting on the wings of this altarpiece in Dijon was created by the artist Melchior Bruderlam just 12 years before the Ghent altarpiece. It's typical of painting of the time. And while the stories it tells are clear, the figures in them, and especially the spaces between them, look awkward to the modern eye. Courtly patrons did value highly one form of painting, however, books of hours. The illuminators of these private prayer books were the cutting-edge painters of their day.
Working within the miniature confines of the prayer book, illuminators of the period were masters of spatial manipulation. For them, an inch of vellum was enough to invoke an entire world.
And in the decades around 1400, manuscript illumination raised its prestige through spectacular artistic achievements. First, pictorial space is confined to a sort of box, like a doll's house, that looks as if it projects outward from the surface of the page. Then, in the second half of the 14th century, a new standard is set. Sealed off from the rest of the page by a frame, the illuminated image reads like a view through an opening or window into a coherent world. Once opened, that world could be infinitely expanded, encompassing whole landscapes in which sacred scenes as well as the activities of everyday life get played out.
Now, instead of a flat surface covered by writing and ornament, there could be windows everywhere, each one opening to a burst of three-dimensional space.
These experiments served a particular aim, namely to enhance the viewer's experience of sacred persons and stories. So illuminators fostered an intimate dialogue between image and beholder that achieves what we expect of great art today. At the climax of this tradition, there emerged a master who could do everything, from infinite landscapes to perfectly realized interiors. In paintings by this exceptional master, the painted image escapes the bounds of the illuminated book. Art historians have attributed these wildly innovative miniatures to the young Jan Van Eyck. Jan Van Eyck's self-portrait, painted in 1433, brings the painter alive in a way that written historical documents of the time cannot. Only fragments of his life story have survived, but those fragments are more than we know about any other northern painter of the time.
In this period, painters didn't enjoy a special status among craftsmen. In fact, they were ranked rather low, on par with tanners and undertakers, maybe because they got their hands dirty, but maybe because they made graven images, something frowned on by the Bible. What is surprising is how much we do know about Van Eyck, and we know about him mainly because of the quality of his work. Sheer artistry caused people to save and to gather facts about the artist. Van Eyck's milieu helped too. The Burgundian court cultivated new ideas about personal skill and about fame. Finally, Van Eyck's artworks themselves speak about the artist. Unlike the anonymous paintings which preceded them, his pictures include signatures, dates, personal mottos, even self-portraits. To a degree never seen before, Van Eyck's works celebrate the person who made them.
Already a famous artist by 1425, Jan Van Eyck's achievements drew him to the attention of the ultimate patron of the day, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. He undertook secret missions for the Duke, traveling around Europe as his ambassador. While traveling, he produced portraits of prospective spouses for Philip, none of which survive. But we do know that one likeness of Isabella of Portugal pleased the Duke so much that he chose to marry her in 1430. For his artistic and ambassadorial services, Van Eyck received lavish payments. When a bookkeeper tried lowering his salary, the Duke intervened, stating that he could find no other painter equal to our taste or as excellent in matters of art and science. And because the Duke held him in such esteem, Van Eyck was free to work for clients who were not based at the courts. More than any other single work, the altarpiece in the town of Ghent in Belgium launched the Renaissance in Northern Europe. It was donated to St. Bavo's Cathedral by one of Van Eyck's other clients, a merchant and the mayor of Ghent, Jos Veit. With its shutters closed, the altarpiece commemorates the donor's piety. Van Eyck shows Veit and his wife in niches, praying to sculpted effigies of saints. Above them, in what seems a cutaway view of an upper room of the actual church, the Virgin receives Christ in her womb. Veit financed an entire private chapel within the cathedral, and it was there, behind the altar, that Van Eyck's great work originally stood.
The name is Joost Veit, was mayor of the city of Ghent in the 15th century and a very rich man. And on the other side...
Today, a full-scale copy lets visitors experience the perfect fit between the chapel and the altarpiece. Over the centuries, reports survive of artists astonished by the work. In 1521, the world-famous painter Albrecht Dürer came to view it and pronounced it a priceless painting of profound understanding. By then, less than 100 years after it was painted, it was already a tourist attraction. Visitors paid high fees to see it. During the iconoclasms that swept Northern Europe in the 16th century, when Protestants smashed the images in churches, Van Eyck's altarpiece was spirited to safety. Under Napoleon, the work was taken to Paris and then was divided up, scattering individual panels across Europe. These were only reunited after the First World War in 1919. 2 of the panels were stolen and held ransom in 1934. This one was never recovered. A copy still marks its place.
The Ghent altarpiece was designed and painted for this chapel. Every painted object in the altarpiece is shown reacting to light as if it's a real object here in space. And you can see this immediately in the closed form of the altar, in which all the statues and the 2 donors, the fights, are all lit exactly from that part of the chapel where the sun streams in and would, if these were real statues, cast shadows and highlights in the way they do in Van Eyck's picture. The closed state is complex. The open state is even more complex. Again, everything in the picture reacts to the light and the space exactly as real figures would in such a situation. But here, because of the nature of the subject, and because he's added this stupendous element of color, because he's multiplied the detail, the level of relations between the world out here and the world of the picture becomes almost infinite. Every one of the jewels, every part of the complex tapestry of this picture is carefully programmed to react to the light that's in this room. So, for example, the figure of Adam, who comes from the left, has highlights in his eye, whereas the figure of Eve, who is shaded in this real space, has no highlights in her eye. There are even certain jewels, ones on the angels on the left, which reflect the actual shape and position of the window which lights them.
Today, the actual painting has been removed from this setting. Van Eyck's masterpiece stands in another part of the church, encased in a chamber of bulletproof glass. It's a willfully complex ensemble, 2-tiered like the closed shutters, and dominated by a vision of God. Throned at the center and looking straight out, the deity subordinates everything to himself, including the viewer, constantly in his gaze. Below him, in the landscape of heavenly paradise, the saved worship eternally on an altar the Lamb of God, symbol of Christ's sacrifice for humanity. And from that altar, the water of the fountain of life flows into our space along a small ditch through paradise's flowery lawn.
This little gully is one of the most momentous passages in the history of European painting. Van Eyck's entire spectacle invites us to soar visually to the distant horizon. Infinity had never been depicted as compellingly as this.
The gully carries the waters of salvation from infinity back to us. Drawing close, we notice amazingly the earth is filled with jewels. This makes sense. Paradise will be paved with precious stones. It also makes symbolic sense, for at this altar mere bread is transformed into the divine body of Christ.
But the gully is more than just a religious symbol.
It distills the essence of the painter's craft. In its transformation into jewels, paint itself performs the kind of miracle that the scene depicted celebrates.
Through sheer artistry, the base matter of paint has been transformed into precious jewels. Through Van Eyck's labor, earth itself has become the perfect image of heaven.
How did Van Eyck do it? How did he make paint, mere pigments, resemble transparent, reflective gemstones? His early admirers suspected that he had discovered some secret process. They assumed that the process was of a chemical or even alchemical kind. The idea that Jan Van Eyck possessed a secret technical skill was amplified by the first historian of Western art, Vasari, who claimed that this northern painter personally invented oil paint. Vasari was wrong. Oil was an ingredient in painting long before Van Eyck, as this painting, the Westminster Readable, created 150 years before Van Eyck, shows.
But Vasari got right the dazzling new effect Van Eyck achieved in oil.
And I've come to the Hamilton Kerr Institute at Cambridge University to discover how Jan Van Eyck transformed base materials into beautiful images. They conserve and restore paintings here, and to do this you have to know how paintings were made.
Well, this is ultramarine, lapis lazuli. It's a mineral that you would have got from what's now Afghanistan. It's transformed into the pigment ultramarine, a very rich blue, by a very complicated procedure of processing.
Yes, and it seems like there are some imperfections.
Yes, there are impurities in the mineral, copper mainly, which they would have extracted during the process.
To purify the blue.
To purify the blue, so that when they were painting with it, it's actually very high quality. It would have been very expensive for that reason, and also because of the transportation in those days, going all the way into Northern Europe.
From across the sea, ultramarine,
Yes.
What materials might he have used for his reds?
In the period, there were two particular red lakes that were most common. Madder. Madder is a plant, it comes from the root. Or cochineal, which is made from the crushed up shells of beetles.
Ah, you can see their little bodies still.
Yes, yes.
And none are moving, huh?
No, they're very dry.
To make it even more.
What Jan Van Eyck did more expertly than any other painter of the time was to build up layers of paint, one on top of the other, to create deeper, richer colors. Then, on top of these, he would add layers of different oil-based glazes, like this one, an almost translucent substance made from the plant matter and pine oil. Then on top of these layers, he would add more layers, layers of oil-based glaze. These were made and applied with incredible care, so that different sections of the painted picture would come to reflect light in a precise and distinctive way, similar to the way the surfaces of the represented objects would, in reality, reflect light. This is different from previous painting, and it's completely different from how we imagine painting to proceed. This isn't about capturing a perception with the brush. It's not about painting forms that resemble, through outline and color, real objects. It's about recreating the object itself by simulating in paint the inner structure of its materials. The effect is a remarkable illusion that what we see is real and not painted. Yet it is all just paint. And this is what amazes me most about Jan Van Eyck. Earlier painting can be exquisite in its own way with elegant lines and plausible details. While parts of these pictures are painted, the artists pursue their effects inconsistently. The most vivid example of this is when it comes to the representation of gold and jewels, something that much of the painting of the time uses to signify holiness.
It's notable that Van Eyck didn't use gold leaf to represent gold objects in his pictures. Instead, he painted objects as golden. He never introduced foreign elements into his picture. He never placed upon the panel that he works, for example, an actual jewel. That was common in the period before Jan Van Eyck. He creates a consistent surface, and that consistency allows the picture to achieve another order of consistency, namely that whatever is in the picture appears consistent with the world outside of the picture. That is, that the whole picture builds up an illusion of a global consistency which we ourselves inhabit.
So to the viewer, the illusion of his paintings, the fiction of the painted world as real, never breaks. And if these pictures look real to us today, what might they have looked like when they were first painted?
It's hard for us to imagine today how Van Eyck's pictures would have been understood by people of the time. Today, we're bombarded by virtual realities which make even photographs look inert. Remember what pictures looked like before Van Eyck. Certainly, the culture was filled with images, yet these looked like man-made artifacts, like beautiful things in the world, rather than like windows open to the world. To what then could Van Eyck's pictures be compared? Only to natural images, which is to say, to reflections, such as could be most vividly observed in mirrors.
This picture of the canon George van der Pele before the Virgin and Child shimmers with reflected light. It shows the cleric brought in front of the Virgin by his patron saint, Saint George, the figure in armor. Jan Van Eyck deliberately fills the scene with reflective surfaces, inviting viewers to observe the similarity between painting and the mirrors that painting can depict. These surfaces multiply the world around. The saint's armor even reflects the artist himself, working on the painting we behold.
A sentence written on the frame adds meaning to these reflections. It compares the Virgin to perfectly reflected light, with God as the illuminating source. Van Eyck's picture then is like the Virgin, being itself a mirror of that same light from God.
Today, painters get their paint ready-made in tubes, but the forgotten alchemy of pigments that Van Eyck mastered still fascinates.
Part of the reason his innovations in oils are so important is because they haven't been improved on. It's absurd to think that given all the other innovations over the centuries, oil painting is still the best way of depicting a human being in a two-dimensional form. It's because of the way in which you can use glazes to suggest a certain kind of vibrancy of the light and reflections, which make it feel like there's something coming out of the picture towards you. But also you can use it in the dark colours to suggest space going away behind. Plus, because it stays wet for a little while, if someone comes to sit for you a day or two later and you see them in a different way, you can put that straight into the picture rather than having to start a whole other layer over the top. even photography, with all its huge benefits and exciting innovations, still can't create the same illusions that a painting can when it's there, because of the way the oil painting is built up in layers, and those layers play games with the light in a way that nothing else can do. It's hard now to just imagine what life was like in art terms before he was around.
Almost more than any other product, paintings are the embodiment of labor. They require not particularly expensive materials. They're made just out of oil and pigments, some expensive, but broadly speaking inexpensive compared to gold and jewels. And what makes them valuable is the labor that went into making them.
Jan Van Eyck's labor raised the status of painting almost immediately. The illusions he created were so convincing that in some ways painting could hide that it was painting. And since his products didn't look handmade, he could claim a higher status than that of mere craftsman working with his hands.
But there were also advantages to consumers. Instead of paying for gold and jewels, now they could buy painted substitutes at a fraction of the cost. So to whom did this new art appeal? The Bruges archive holds an amazing collection of records dating back to the early 15th century, when Bruges was the economic hub of Europe, full of wealthy merchants. The townspeople who lived and worked here noted all the important events in the life of their town. And one of these remarkable records takes us back to the birth of a whole new market for painting.
This is an important piece of the puzzle. It's an extraordinary document. Dated 1432, it records a visit made by the city magistrates and the mayor to the atelier of Jan Van Eyck in Bruges. It speaks of their wanting to see the work of his assistants, which means that by this point, Van Eyck's not working alone, but that he has already an extensive workshop. It also indicates the interest that the citizenry took already in Van Eyck's art. The visit of the Bruges magistrates, documented here, marks the beginning of a long mutual relationship between a new type of painting and a new urban elite.
And the kind of painting they desired more than any other was a portrait of themselves.
A portrait is and ever was a lasting memorial to you. It's something that grants you posterity. It's something your family will keep and value. Portraits had been only there for saints and kings. The new portrait painting allows more modest families to have a replica of Grandpa that can be hung on the living room wall. That's a new idea. It also allows you to say, I have had the great Van Eyck paint my portrait. Courts of kings and Dukes of Burgundy get Van Eyck portraits. This tells you how important I am. There's a fashion for having yourself painted. It's a very secular urge, because this isn't on an altarpiece. This isn't somewhere where people will say, he's very godly. But it is a conspicuous way of showing that you are a match for princes.
Jan Van Eyck excelled in portraiture, and he created innovative devices, such as the three-quarter view, where the sitter turns halfway towards a profile position. Still today, the classic portrait format. After Van Eyck, portrait painting became a kind of industry. Its master was the Bruges painter Hans Memling. Memling took Van Eyck's innovative format and developed it with backgrounds and more detail. His work is remarkable as a document of the people who lived in Bruges and Flanders almost 600 years ago. But in Van Eyck's hands, portraiture does more than simply record a person's physical appearance. It realizes, in the form of a concrete vision, the sitter's deepest spiritual desires as well. This is one of Jan Van Eyck's most celebrated works. It's a painting of the most important man in the administration of the Dukes of Burgundy, the chancellor of the entire Burgundian realm, a man named Nicolas Rolin. Rolin rose from a humble estate to become one of the most powerful men in Europe. One chronicler wrote that it was humanly impossible to imagine how rich Nicolas Rolin was. To enter Rolin's world, we need to go to an extraordinary place south of Dijon and encounter there the work of another supreme Flemish painter. It's an altarpiece painted by the great painter Roger van der Weyden, who emerged slightly later than Van Eyck and who developed under Van Eyck's influence. Commissioned by Nicolas Rolin, it was painted in Flanders and transported here. Nicolas Rolin was a master calculator. He was the chief administrator of Europe's wealthiest region, and he knew how to turn a profit on every transaction he handled. Like others of the time, Rolin believed that heaven had an economy too, but a different one than here on earth. This idea of a divine calculation appears at the center of the great Last Judgment altarpiece that Rolin commissioned for his hospital here in Beaune. Like the Ghent altarpiece, this great ensemble has been moved out of its original home. It once sat just across the courtyard from its current position in the chapel of the Charity Hospital dating from the early 15th century, entirely funded by Nicolas Rolin. The sick would have laid in beds like these, and from there they could have seen the altar and the Mass celebrated for them. On ordinary days, with the altar closed, they would have seen a portrait of their benefactor, Rolin. And on feast days, when the altar opened up, they could have beheld a spectacle of the fate that awaited them. And from that spectacle, God himself would look down upon them and beyond them to the spectacle of Nicolas Rolin's own generosity. His hospital with its altarpiece would have been a striking public show of generosity. The picture he commissioned from Jan Van Eyck is both an emblem of piety and an inventory of Rolin's staggering wealth. It shows Rolin praying to the Virgin and Christ who appear beside him. But the painting invites us to pass beyond this foreground dialogue to the extraordinary landscape that opens up behind them. Van Eyck draws our eye there by placing on the parapet, at the exact geometric center of his panel, two figures. One, dressed in a red turban, is probably Jan Van Eyck himself. He shows his companion the view just as his painting allows us to see it. And what he shows is his life world, a bustling northern European trade city built upon a river open to the world. And behind Rolin, we find one amazing detail: vineyards.
This is the world into which Van Eyck sends us as he launches our eye into that glorious view. Among his vast possessions, Rolin owned vineyards in Burgundy, such as these. Already then, Burgundy produced some of Europe's finest wines. Vineyards generated the region's wealth, and they contributed to Rolin's riches, and thus, in a way, made possible Van Eyck's picture itself. By showing Rolin's vineyards, Van Eyck takes us back to the artwork's economic source. he shows us that this is as much a part of his painting as are the pigments of which it's made.
Roland's vineyards directly funded the running of the hospital and produced the wine drunk at Mass before the altar. And while the painting documents both the source of Roland's great wealth and his charitable works, it also represents something else.
The painting fulfills one of the deepest desires of Christians of the time, physically to see sacred persons.
In Van Eyck's day, people understood vision differently than they do today. They believed that when one saw an object, something of its physical substance entered the eye. They believed, therefore, that sacred things, such as religious images, could enter the soul through the portal of the eye. This belief explains a key aspect of late medieval religion. During Mass, the bread of the host was held to be the body of Christ. And because in seeing something, one participated in its substance, by simply beholding the host, one communed with Christ's body. Within churches, there were special places for visual communion. This is one such place, a private chamber built into the side of a church, but it's also part of a domestic space.
This here is an amazing survival. It's a private prayer gallery in Bruges, and these windows behind me overlook the Church of Our Lady. But it's built right into someone's private home. Visual experience of the private person is thrusting itself into sacred space.
By looking from this prayer chapel towards the altar in the church, we enter into the mechanics of vision as they were understood in Van Eyck's day. Suddenly, the painting of Roland and the Madonna takes on a new meaning. In their prayers, Christians sought above all to visualize the person they worshipped. And so, in Van Eyck's painting, Nicolas Roland can see this wish fulfilled. The content of his prayer sits there as real and palpable as he. Paint has made the Virgin as present, as material, as it were, in Roland's experience, as the book he holds, as the vineyards he owns.
The story of how Van Eyck transformed painting into the art of arts must end somewhere else, however. This final chapter unfolds in a panel that hangs here in London.
This is Van Eyck's most haunting painting. It's an incredibly modern-looking image of a man and a woman from long ago inside a bedroom. Everything about the picture is revolutionary. The full-length portraits, the profusion of detail, the sheer complexity of it all. The sequence of its owners attests to its preciousness. It passed almost immediately into royal collections, where it stayed until it came to Britain in the early 19th century. And it's been in the National Gallery ever since, where it remains one of the most popular pictures. It's partly the painting's realism that fascinates. Capturing perfectly the room and its inhabitants, the picture is like a time capsule of lived experience. Once arrived in this room in Bruges at 1434, we become fascinated, even unsettled, by what's taking place in this bygone here and now. Early documents record only a name, Arnolfini. A simple portrait of a man and his wife, then? But the picture's too unique and the details too intriguing to leave it there. Historians have proposed theories, including a persistent one that Jan Van Eyck, with his brush, testified to the event of the couple's marriage.
2 years ago, an art historian published a new theory of Van Eyck's masterpiece, which put everything in a completely different light. As it happens, this historian is my wife, and her simple solution to the great puzzle was published the day before our marriage.
The center of much of the debate has been the identity of the couple portrayed, since nothing in the picture itself, as it now survives, tells us who they are.
For a long time, scholars have known that it was likely to be a member of the Arnolfini family who are from Lucca in Italy but lived in Bruges. Giovanni Arnolfini was decided upon as the likely candidate. And he had married someone called Costanza Trenta, and everything seemed to be right until it was discovered that she had died at least by 1433, which is the year before the painting is dated. There are several possibilities. One is that it's a different Giovanni Arnolfini, or a different Arnolfini altogether. Another is that there was another wife that's not documented. Or you could decide that it is this woman, Costanza, and perhaps it's not a wedding or a betrothal, and in fact it's not even a straightforward portrait. Everything about it is calling out for a kind of explanation. So, for example, Mr. Arnolfini, the way he seems so melancholic and his gesture is so enigmatic, what is he doing? The difference between the portrayal of his face and her face, most people had said, well, she's idealized because she's a female, and that's true. I mean, she definitely looks, you know, you'd be hard-pressed to find a person who looks like that in real life. She looks like a porcelain doll. Whereas he really looks so convincing as a facial type. So what could that discrepancy be? I started to look at the details that for some have been seen as supporting the marriage claim, and for others were seen as just details of objects. The mirror at the back, which has a lot of connotations, but one of the details of the mirror are scenes of the Passion of Christ around the outside. All of the scenes of Christ living are on the side where Giovanni is standing on the left side, and all of the scenes of Christ dead and resurrected are on the right side. It's a daytime scene, but there's a candle burning. I mean, why would Van Eyck include a lit candle in a daytime scene? And why would he bother to show the detail of only two candles, one of which has gone out and one of which is burning? The actual juxtaposition, I think, of a lit candle over Giovanni and a gutted candle over Costanza indicates a kind of literal illustration. It's like to just write it off as a kind of snapshot of reality really misses the point, I think, that's being made. The point that's being made is that she's dead and he's not, that he is basically honoring her as a very important part of his life that's now gone. I'm certain that mine won't be the last theory. It's a painting that provides endless opportunity for interpretation.
It's not for nothing that the mirror is an age-old symbol of death. The images in a mirror are fleeting, and thus mirrors remind us of the fleeting character of our lives, which passes quickly. Van Eyck's mirrors are of a completely different kind. They preserve what they display. Jan Van Eyck still stands there now in our present moment with his companion. He writes above the mirror, Jan Van Eyck was here in the past tense, and yet the painting remains always in the present tense. Van Eyck is here in the inscription, in the mirror, in the painting. And Jan Van Eyck's painting is like the mirror it depicts. It makes people present eternally. It brings the living together with the dead. It joins together time and keeps in the same present the artist and his beholder.
He created beautiful fictional worlds, perfectly consistent with the optical reality we inhabit. And Van Eyck puts all this artistry to the highest possible end, to defeat death and time, and to glimpse, as if from outside of our world, paradise itself. Van Eyck's impact on the way other artists painted was immediate and huge. In the Netherlands, his art was the gold standard of a painting industry that flourished in that region until the 17th century and beyond. His lasting influence is felt whenever ambitious artists of any era stake their claim to greatness. Whenever painters propose that painting is the supreme art, and indeed whenever they reflect on painting through painting, the ghost of Van Eyck is somewhere to be seen. No, Van Eyck didn't invent oil painting, but he did introduce something even more momentous. When we stroll today through art museums, when we consider from a certain distance what it is that these galleries display as art, we observe a certain kind of thing. Not sculpture, not tapestry, not fabulous ensembles of gold and jewels. Rather, rows and rows of one kind of thing, namely paintings, each framed and movable, each a little world unto itself.
Without Van Eyck, I do not think these peculiar things would have possessed the magic necessary to launch their extraordinary career.
So this is another of Van Eyck's legacies, our picture of a picture gallery. Van Eyck inscribed his self-portrait with the words, "Als ich kann." It means literally, "as I can." The motto says, in effect, this thing, this spectacular painting of myself, shows not only what I look like, but also what I can do, what my powers are. And so the artist draws us to the puzzle we've been pursuing all along, the enigma of Jan Van Eyck, of that one self and its amazing capabilities.
Self-portraiture is natural to the images Van Eyck makes. As he builds up a world with paint, as he uses paint to resemble gems and reflective surfaces, it is inevitable within the logic of that image that this world, and with it Van Eyck the painter, will be represented in his image. It's this indeliberate, accidental form of self-portrait that is more natural to his art. In a sense, it's a humble gesture. It says that the artist isn't the center of his creation. He's at the periphery of things. He's part of the world as we are part of the world. At another level, though, it's a statement of the greatest ambition, for it says that painting, this supreme art, is capable not only of resembling nature, but of being nature.
The moment painting becomes a mirror, it must represent itself as, in some sense, without an author, without an inventor, as natural, since no one invents or makes the world, except perhaps God. Next time, Albrecht Dürer and the birth of the modern artist, how one Northern European genius advertised himself as a godlike creator.
Northern Renaissance continues tomorrow with The Birth of the Artist, slightly later at 1:45 here on BBC4.